just to quickly just mention who is here, we have a bunch of students who've been working on the project on this particular trip. I'm sure you can all see them. We have two members of the Polokwane Museum, Isaac and Nico, who joined us. They've spent most of the week on site with us, just watching what we're doing, looking at progress, seeing our project and chatting with us. We also have members of South African National Parks here, Innocent, Gutavo, and Kamachelo, our old field guide. And then Esty is here as well. Esty manages the facility and elements of the reserve as well, and the future of the reserve, and probably a whole range of things that you do, I'm sure. So it's quite a nice mixed bag. The idea for today was just to give you guys some feedback about what we've done so far, a bit about our project, and then also to have an opportunity for the students on the project to present some of their work that they've been doing, but also the projects that they're currently carrying out. So that includes PhD, Masters, and Honours students who are involved in various elements within this project and on various different aspects of it. So from my point of view, or from my side, I'm just going to give you a little introduction about who we are and what we've done. We call ourselves the Hunter-Gatherer Archaeological Research Project. The intention behind HARP is to study hunter-gatherer archaeological sequences. That's what we're particularly interested in. And we do that in a number of ways. Primarily, though, we focused in this part of the world. So we have had projects in the Northern Cape. We have a project currently running in Mpumalanga province as well. But most of our research happens here on the Mapungubwe landscape. HARP is a mixture of people. It's myself, and then it's various postgraduate students involved. Most of the people who are here digging with us are part of our little HARP community. And we sort of chat a lot, and it's quite a nice interactive group. But HARP itself, the interest with HARP really is to try and create a history or prehistory of South Africa that acknowledges the role that hunter-gatherer societies played. By hunter-gatherer, I'm meaning San communities, which I'll talk about in a moment. But that's really what we're trying to target, and in particular on this landscape, and I'll get into detail shortly. So that's what we're looking at, is hunter-gatherers, their sequences, their histories, how those fitted in to a lot of the sequences across Southern Africa. And we try and redress some of the approaches towards hunter-gatherers, some of the earlier views that people hold about hunter-gatherers, and we're trying to challenge some of that. So why the Middle Limpopo Valley? Why do we focus ourselves in this part of the world? This part of the world is particularly unique. It's seen archaeological research for a very long time compared to many other parts of Southern Africa. Not as long as the Cape regions. It's quite long because of one site in particular, and that's obviously Mapungubwe. Mapungubwe is the most important site in this landscape that we generally think about it. And most of the research for the last nearly a decade now, since the 30s, has been focused on Mapungubwe. And it's been focused on particularly the rise of Mapungubwe. So here in the background, you can see the Mapungubwe hill. That's obviously a photograph. And here's a redrawing of what it might have looked like. So on top is the chief. He would have lived in that area over there with royal wives. This is where the golden rhino, so there's the golden rhino and the bowl and the scepter and all the beads, was found in this area over here of the hill. When you visit the hill, when you climb up the hill, there's the entrance roughly up onto the top of the hill. So that's happening over there. So this is where the gold was found. This is where the chief lived. Down below these rocks here, over there, is the court area. And across the site, there's some really important and very significant findings. Not just the gold, but there's 26,000 glass beads that they found. There's 12,000 gold beads. There's evidence of royalty, or the chief living on the hill, royal people living around the hill, and then the rest of the Mapungubwe community living a bit further away. The way that settlement is structured is very different to any other settlement. Normally you have a kraal in the center, and then you have houses around it. At Mapungubwe, because politically these people became much more authoritative in the landscape, they started to control vast amounts of wealth and international wealth coming in from Southeast Asia and so on. Because their society changed, they changed their settlement structure, because their settlement structure was a reflection of their belief systems and their cosmologies. And so shifting from, initially it was at K2, which is very close to Mapungubwe, shifting to Mapungubwe was partly driven by the fact that they needed to reorganize their settlement to reflect their new values, political authorities, royal elites, and so on and so forth. So this is very important. And this took place, it began in about at least 8900, where you start to see changes. You start to see international wealth arriving in this area. By 81,000, that started to intensify. And then 200 or so years later, 220 years later, roughly, Mapungubwe established. It's about a 300-year period, roughly. However, before this began, farmer groups started arriving on this landscape, and until that point, and throughout the rise of Mapungubwe, hunter-gatherers were living here. Hunter-gatherers in the history of this particular region have been particularly neglected. We've tended to favor the archaeology of Mapungubwe. That's what the focus has been on, by and large. Everyone who's, most of you are familiar with this region. There's lots of rock art. There's a lot of shelters around here. So we know there's a lot of hunter-gatherer stuff going on. But until the late 1990s, so that's good 60 years of research at Mapungubwe had taken place, did someone really start paying attention to hunter-gatherers. There were some studies a little bit further away in Zimbabwe in the 60s. They're not very helpful for us today because our methods have changed, our systems of categorization have changed. But other than that, there has almost been nothing happening here. And part of the problem with this is that we have this view, and this is why I use this image, because I really like this image. We have this view that hunter-gatherers are isolated people. The San living in the Kalahari are isolated, they're living alone, they're not in contact with anyone else. And so we have this perspective of them that they are egalitarian, they don't have conflict, they don't fight with one another, they don't have leaders, they have elder groups, they live in these small units, and so on and so forth. And this is information that has been gathered largely since the 50s, but also during the colonial era. Why I like this image is because if you have a look at these four individuals, this is taken in the Makadikari Pans in Botswana, they do look isolated. They don't look just the four of them walking through the pans. But those figures in the background, which you can't really see, those are cattle. And cattle obviously aren't indigenous to this part of the world. Hunter-gatherers did provide services to farming communities when they were living here. So when you look at this image at first, what makes them seem quite disconnected from the world around them, when we take a closer look and we understand the context, we realize that they actually are very much connected to it. And that's something that we're trying to examine in this part of the world. And it's why to us this is so important, because we speak about Mapungubwe, what happened at Mapungubwe, which is undoubtedly important. But when we talk about Mapungubwe, we forget to talk about these people. We create a very one-sided view of our archaeological record. And what we also end up doing inadvertently is denying a role to these people who played a part in what went on in this landscape. And so that's what our project's trying to achieve. It's trying to change that slightly. We're not the first people to do it, but there are others. As you can see, this is a map of all the sites. So the black dots over here are hunter-gatherer sites. We call them foragers. Hunter-gatherer, forager are terms that you can interchange. Here, for example, is Little Muck, which is where we've been spending most of our time, and I'll talk about that. Bellona Main Shelter, Bellona Shelters 2 and 3, also in the National Park. Chisiku Shelter is on Vembia, on the other side of by the Pontrift Road. And then in Botswana, Zombo Shelter and Mafunyane Shelter are two sites that I excavated as well. So we have quite a few sites now. These are just the sites that have been excavated. There's a lot more that have been identified by myself or others. And this area, especially where we are now, this northern part of Venetia, Little Muck, because of the survey work there when it was still with De Beers, and like Hackthorn, for example, there's so many sites that we've surveyed and identified. Tom Huffman has surveyed this whole area, and he's got something like 1,250 villages that he's identified, spanning from at least 8,900 until the more recent times. There's also a lot of mixed identity sites. So what we mean by these, so there's Jao Shelter, Kambaku Camp, and Euphorbia Top. These are sites where it seems like there's some evidence of forager community people or forager communities living among farmers or spending time in farmer settlements. And this is something that we're interested as a project as well, because these people don't really acknowledge that. We tend to put Bushmen in one box and we put farmers in another box, and these boxes are separate. But what we're seeing more and more of, and which we're arguing for, is that those boxes don't exist. These people are integrated, they're meeting, they're exchanging ideas, they're intermarrying in some instances, they're exchanging goods and values and knowledge systems, and that's what we're studying. Again, we're not the first people to do this by any stretch of the imagination. There are many people who've come before us, and it's because of that work that we can do this kind of stuff. But that is what we're trying to achieve with this particular project. So the project was launched in 2020. This was the first field. This is not the first field season, but our first field season was Little Muck Shelter. This is just some aerial footage of the site. It was launched in 2020. Unfortunately, as with everything in the world, heavily delayed by COVID. So it had a very big impact on what we were able to achieve. But nonetheless, we went into Little Muck Shelter and we began excavating. This footage was taken this year in March. So by then, it was our fourth visit to the site. We've done 2 weeks in October in 2020, We did 1 week in May last year. We did 2 weeks in September, I think it was last year, and then we did a week earlier this year. We've now just completed another week at Little Muck. We've at the end of this week we will complete our work at Leokwe Hill for now at least, and then next week we are in Venetia Shelter. But the Venetia Complex. I'm not going to talk about that because they're the subject of talks coming up. But here you can see kind of where we're working. We're spending a lot of time on the sort of left-hand side of the site. We've also spent a little bit of time in the shelter next door, but most of our time spent in that area. And it's in that area that we're finding a really amazing collection of artifacts from primarily stone tools, but also trade wealth, glass beads, shell beads, faunal waste. On the right-hand side of the shelter, we've spent a little bit of time excavating there. It's very wet, so we can't really get much into the ground, and it seems quite mixed, but we are investigating that further to see what we can do there. Okay, so here's just the final aerial view of the site, where you can just see it. It's a really amazing shelter. So we've also excavated in front here. You can see the packs of logs and rocks from rehabilitation. We've excavated in front because one of the early ideas with Little Muck is that it was used as an initiation site. And so part of our intention to understand the space of Little Muck was to figure out if other people were spending time at the shelter. Perhaps we could find evidence of it outside. So in that video, this is where we were excavating in the video. You can see all these grey blocks on the outside. That's where we've been excavating as well. And this is the deeper recess where we spent a little bit of time, but for various reasons, it's proving quite challenging. We've now extended this. We've now excavated 2 squares over here. So we basically connected this with the previous excavations at the site. We've excavated 2 squares over here, but none of those have reached bedrock yet. So we will have to come back and we'll at least dig those 2 down. We've also extended into this direction as well, where we've excavated 4 squares over there. So we have a lot of excavation squares now. If we can't figure out what's going on at Little Muck, then we only have ourselves to blame, because there's a lot of archaeology that we have to play with at the moment. So just to give you a little bit of information before I wrap up about what we've actually found, just some of the exciting things. So these results here are primarily from Chante and SK's honours project, where we looked at the distribution of certain materials, so certain cultural material. The initial excavators believed that the site, there was a very small scale occupation at the site, and then in the first millennium AD it started picking up, and they started producing crafts. So this is at a time when farmers started to come into the area. When the Zizo guys settled here for the first time, there's a massive increase in artifacts at Little Muck Shelter. But these artifacts are mostly scrapers, and it looks like they were producing vast amounts of craft goods to trade with farmer communities. Because at the same time, we start to see ceramics, beads, metal come into the site, which is linked to farmers, not to foragers. And so, and then after that, it drops off. Okay, we're trying to understand the increase. We're also trying to understand the drop-off. So when we take our figures from our research, we see a very different pattern, or to some extent a very different pattern. So this over here, VDV1+, this is very early first millennium, from as far as we can tell at this stage. So we're looking at about 2,000 years ago, and we see a massive increase in the amount of stone tools in this early period. Now, this is a time when the previous excavators thought the camp was barely being used. It then drops off to eventually PBG1, where there's another increase. PBG1 is the Zizo period. So that's when we were only expecting to see an increase at that level. But instead, we have this really big increase initially. So to us, it looks like perhaps more what's happening here is there's a very intense occupation, at least when farmers are maybe arriving in the area or before they arrive. And that drops off. And then during the Zizo period, when trade starts to pick up, that's where we see things spike again. And so that's slightly different. If you look at the ceramics, you can see they increase at the same time that we get the stone tools increasing. So this likely is as a result of trade. We see shell remains increasing at this period in time as well. And that is interesting because when we look at the stone scrapers that they're finding at the site, when we've done experimental work on them to try and figure out what they were used for, they're being used mostly to work hard materials, not animal skin, which is what people always thought. They're being used to work hard materials like shell, bone, wood, maybe ivory. So when we're seeing a big increase in shell and an increase in scrapers, there might be some relationship, and that's something we have to investigate further. But we're also seeing sustained use, exploitation of animals. So during this whole period, we see a lot of periods where there's good numbers of faunal remains that are found at the site. And so that's encouraging to suggest that people were living at the site throughout these levels, even when for example, stone tools were dropping off. It may even indicate things such as similar sized populations at the site, but that would depend on the rate of deposition. Then finally, one very interesting thing that we found as well is the initial ideas were after 81,000, Bushmen left the site and farmers moved in. They took over the site and turned it into an initiation site. Because of what I described to you in the beginning, that we don't like these concepts of boxes, that we think it's much more open, this was an idea from the earlier work that just we wanted to investigate further, because we just thought that we didn't feel that it was a great explanation. So in these levels here, these are the levels dating to Mapungubwe. So at this point in time, K2 and Mapungubwe were occupied. So we're talking about the Mapungubwe period. And what we're looking at here are drawings of stone tools from that period for the diagnostic of hunter-gatherers. So this evidence that we've been able to find now, and this is just scratching the surface really, it quite strongly indicates that hunter-gatherers didn't leave Little Muck when Mapungubwe came into being. They continued to live here, and they lived here throughout the Mapungubwe kingdom. And that's a really interesting finding, because our whole argument is that they were involved. And now we've got evidence to say they were definitely here. And we know at this site they were heavily involved in trading with farmers. So at a site with a lot of trade evidence, we have their presence in the Mapungubwe period. So as far as we think is going on here, they were around during Mapungubwe, they were trading during Mapungubwe, and so they were contributing to this economic system that led to the appearance of Southern Africa's first state-level society. So they were part of it, and that's why our research, we feel, is really important. So our work is ongoing. It doesn't end here. These are just some images from some of the field seasons, some of the work that we've been doing at Little Muck. We now are slowly moving away from Little Muck. I estimate we have about a week's worth of work at Little Muck, and then we'll be finished there, for now at least, until we want to disprove ourselves, I guess, at a later stage. And then we're going to move on to Leokwe Hill and Mbere, and then a number of other sites which Anne will talk about as well. So yeah, we do have a number of projects that are ongoing: rock art studies, specialist studies into faunal remains, into worked bone tools, into the stone tools, and we'll probably have many more that come up over the years as well. Okay, so I'll end there. I'm not going to carry on, but we obviously have a number of people that have assisted us financially and through support. The Paleontological Scientific Trust is a big fund of our students. Most of our students have funding from them. The National Research Foundation is supporting our research. They've been supporting the research since 2020, and that money will go through until at least 2024. We've also received support from the University of Pretoria, and as well as support from the South African National Parks, which we've been very grateful for, to be allowed to work in this incredible part of South Africa and on this amazing archaeology. So thank you very much to everyone who supported us so far, and hopefully initiatives like this and the papers we eventually publish and the articles we write and so on will justify all the support that we've been provided from everyone. And of course, now this is our first stay at Venetia, first big stay at Venetia, so we're very grateful to Venetia for having us as well. And hopefully we don't wreck the place too badly that we don't get invited back.
Yeah. Hi guys. Okay, so as Tim said, I'm looking at trade. Last year I looked at trade at Little Muck, and this year we're moving on to Leokwe Hill. Okay, so trade around the world has significantly contributed to economic, political, and social changes that can be seen across the archaeological landscape. Such changes have been noted alongside Central Southern Africa's participation in international trade networks along the Indian Ocean. Because the items that circulated through these trade networks were thought to represent status, wealth, and political power, individuals in the Middle Limpopo Valley began to accumulate these items by controlling the distribution and redistribution processes thereof. It has been argued that these wealth items contributed towards the creation and maintenance of class differentiation, elite identities, and social-political complexity within farmer settlements. For this reason, most archaeological studies in the Middle Limpopo Valley have been primarily concerned with understanding trade networks as they contributed to more prominent farmer centers. This in turn led to the idea that foragers lacked abundant cultural materials, and they were also thought to be without political power and socio-economic influence. As such, forager contributions within the larger narrative of the region's socio-political and economic development went and still is largely unnoticed. This has also limited our understanding of the role that foragers played within these networks. However, material evidence from both shelters and farmer settlements have indicated that resident forager groups were active participants within these economies. We're gonna play.
It is. But
Cool. Yeah. So recent excavations at Little Muck Shelter showed an increase of forager-associated items from the early 1st millennium AD up to about AD 1000. This included items such as formal tools, ostrich eggshell, work bone, and land snail shell. A similar increase was noted at other forager shelters on the landscape, such as Dumbu and Bellona, Maine. Interestingly, all these shelters also showed a notable increase in stone tool densities from the pre-contact period going into the early 1st millennium AD. This suggests that production processes started to occur and gradually intensified along increased farmer occupation of the area. Over time, trade evidence also increased and seemed to peak after about AD 900. This intensification, along with the appearance of glass beads, ceramic materials, and metal objects, suggests that goods were produced in excess as a means of trading with farmer settlements. Essentially, we see a period of intense interaction with and involvement of forager groups in farmer economies, beginning from AD 900 onwards. These are some of the items that we found at Little Muck. So though various shelters have been linked to forager-farmer interactions, artifact densities at Little Muck suggest a more intense forager-farmer relation. After AD 1000, there is an obvious decrease in items relating to forager craft production and trade. Hall and Smith, the previous excavators of the site, argued that the rise of social-political complexity and the centralization of economic networks across the landscape pushed foragers to the edge of local trade economies. These changing relations are evident in the sudden drop-off of forager-associated items and a broader availability of farmer-associated items at the shelter. In fact, most of the glass beads and decorated ceramics were found within the layers thought to represent traditional K2 and Mapungubwe periods. 22 ceramic pieces, 12 of which were decorated, and 94 glass beads were found within this phase. Such a great increase in farmer-associated items, alongside the prominent decrease of forager-associated items, hints at an occupational shift occurring at the shelter. So to better understand these forager and farmer relations and trade arrangements, we aim to explore the relationship between two sites that were actively involved in the economy from the mid-1st millennium AD, and this includes Little Muck Shelter and Leokwe Hill. Hall and Smith argued that the spatial proximity of Little Muck and Leokwe Hill contributed to the role that Little Muck's foragers played within local trade systems. Leokwe is about 1.5 kilometers from Little Muck, and that's why they thought that. So during Calabresi's work, he also excavated Leokwe previously. During his work at the site, he found evidence for forager and farmer craft activities, production processes, and ritual activities, along with multiple kraals. In order to better understand the farmer settlement and to determine whether a shift did occur from Little Muck to Leokwe Hill, we will be looking at chronological changes, craft production, the frequency of crafted goods, as well as other forager-associated items at both Little Muck and Leokwe Hill. had foragers from Little Muck become active within the Leokwe Hill space, the presence of their items should be observable and aid us in determining whether craft goods and practices were moved from the shelter to the settlement. Excavated rock shelters across the Middle Limpopo Valley highlight the importance of acknowledging a forager presence in local economies. Only by examining the trajectories of trade items in both a forager and a farmer context can a more inclusive and regionalized perspective of the landscape be obtained. This study will examine the possible shifts that occurred between Little Muck and Leokwe regarding craft productions, trade wealth, and trade patterns. By investigating these shifts, the study will also examine the possibility of settlement transitions as foragers moved away from traditional rock shelters and began producing and perhaps even residing in fixed homesteads. The overall aim of this project is also to develop a more inclusive history of the region and to acknowledge the participation of indigenous forager groups in local social, political, and economic networks across the Middle Limpopo Valley. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Siphesihle Kuhlase, for those who don't know, which I'm sure there are people who don't, but everyone calls me SK, you can call me that, it's also fine. The title of my presentation is Relations in Spaces, Hunter-Gatherers of the Middle Limpopo Valley. So I am also interested in investigating hunter-gatherers and how they basically lived in the Middle Limpopo Valley. So I would want to provide to everyone, I know it's a lot of text and there's been a lot of pictures, so when you see text like, hell no, now we have to read. It's okay, I'll take you through this process, but I think it is very significant that I introduce it like this because Tim has done very well to contextualize hunter-gatherers in the MOV, and he went a bit further, but it is important also to acknowledge that these dynamics that we are seeing in the MOV, they're not just only particular to it, because the questions that we ask in the MOV, they are also informed by this broader regional landscape, right? So the interaction between hunter-gatherers and different groups across the Southern African landscape began around 2,000 years ago when farmers were moving in, and especially herders with sheep were moving in, right? So the movement of these different groups, it had a significant impact on many factors, including settlement patterns, subsistence patterns, and even identity formation, which is something that I dealt with and tackled at Little Muck, and we'll expand a bit later. So the changes that we have seen then in the Middle Limpopo Valley, they resulted as well in these political, social, and economic systems, primarily because different groups were moving in, interaction was intensifying, settlement patterns were changing, and so on, right? We do know of the arrival of farmers and their interaction in the Middle Limpopo Valley now. Let's seem contextualized. They first occupied places such as Schroeder, moved on to K2, and then Mapungubwe, where we see the establishment of socio-political state complexity. I will touch on a bit that later on when I present my research outcomes from my honors project. So to provide a broader background, most of the things that I've described actually they are portrayed in this image. If you see in this image over there on my left top corner, this is an image from Edmundberg, which is a site that is very close to where we are. It's located right here at Venetia. I hope we get an opportunity to see it. It details fatal sheep, which is species that changed interaction between different groups, and not just only the interaction in terms of exchange and trade relations, but also ideological and spiritual interaction. Hence, these images are portrayed in rock art. We also see an intensification in the production of iron. This is a furnace from an Iron Age site. So the production of iron also changed the landscape and introduced a new item that people who had previously occupied the landscape did not have access to, nor the expertise, well, let me say the resources to manufacture that item. And then later on, we see this boom of farmer settlement at a higher level, almost at state level society, like Mapungubwe, which has been mentioned, and also most importantly, Great Zimbabwe. There are many others, like Kami. Recently, Mapela Hill is another site that has been proposed to, in fact, predate Mapungubwe, but that is not the subject of today. Particularly here in the Middle Limpopo Valley, Mapungubwe, as I've said, is one of the most important sites, and there are a lot of interesting artifacts that we find from the Middle Limpopo Valley, which are under current investigation. They tell us a lot, not just only the normative items we have like glass beads, stone tools, and so on. I have this image here of it has different names, not just across Southern Africa, but across Africa as a whole. Other people call it Murawaraba, others call it Mankala game. This game now, it has been shown that it has been at the center of these two groups that we are investigating. So I simply have this image here just to show to everyone that there are different items of material culture, not just only those used in trade and exchange, that we can use to investigate interaction between different groups, right? To speed up the presentation on this image here, the top one, I have a view from the northern part of the landscape. This is called the Mbere complex. So we call it a complex because there are different aspects to the site. I will expand a bit more on that later. I also included it here because it is one of the sites that captures the interaction between the two groups. And this is why, obviously, I'm interested in it, right? But before we move on to Mbere complex, I won't be long on Little Muck because I think Tim has provided a very good background on what happened at Little Muck. But I'm sure everyone is familiar with the image now. This is an image of Little Muck, which was a site for my honors project. So at Little Muck, there were a lot of interesting findings that I think in the long run will change the way we view and conceptualize hunter-gatherers. Of course, we are not the first people to study this, but moving forward and using the data from Little Muck, we can learn a lot of things, right? One of them is co-occupation and hybrid identities. Now we are learning that hunter-gatherers and farmers did not just only exchange items with one another, but at a certain stage, they co-occupied the same space, which led to the hybridization of identities, right? So we are seeing a continuous usage of space between these two groups, but possibly as a hybrid group. How do we establish that? I'm sure it's a curious question. How do you know, right? Because we do not have the descendants of those hybridized groups. So we use different material culture items to establish that. Stone tool frequencies have been shown in the previous slide. They also can tell us a lot, and most importantly, OES beads, because we do know that the manufacture of OES beads differs between farmers, hunter-gatherers, and herders. They differ in terms of the size of the beads. So, for example, if you find a larger bead in a hunter-gatherer site, that bead would be manufactured by hunter-gatherers, but for trade with farmers. And then smaller beads would be used for ornamentation by the hunter-gatherers. So when you see a mixture of these beads and various frequencies across time, then something interesting is going on in that site. Glass beads as well are an important item that can tell us a lot about the identities of these people and how they interacted and exchanged with one another. Ceramics, we do know that they are a farmerware. They are usually manufactured by farmers. There are arguments that much earlier hunter-gatherers did perhaps manufacture ceramics, but we do know that ceramics, which we have linked to certain faces like the Mapungubwe facie, the K2 facie, and the Leokwe facie, the Zizo facie, those were farmer groups who manufactured ceramics. So, for instance, when you find these ceramics in hunter-gatherer sites bearing these faces, it obviously means that hunter-gatherers traded them from farmers. But interestingly enough, that cannot be the only argument. Maybe hunter-gatherers, or rather farmers who were manufacturing the same ceramic style, occupied the same space with hunter-gatherers. Remember from the previous slide, I highlighted that what we are learning now is hybrid identities and the continuous usage of space, which we can break down using these same material remains, right? Pontus, I didn't do much on Pontus. I just thought this image was interesting, so I put it there. So not to waste any time, I will move on now to Mbere complex, which is the subject of study for my master's research. I said that we call the site a complex because it has three components, right? As you can see on the map, these components are labeled as A, B, and C. C being the open living area, and then B being the rain partitioning area, and then A is the shelter area. Completely interesting, because we do know that spaces like C were predominantly occupied by farmers to keep cattle, sheep, and goats, which is what we see at Leokwe here, right? Open spaces that were used to keep stock. And then we have a shelter, which we do know that it's a hunter-gatherer habitat, right? Like Little Mark, it's a shelter, but it lacks sea, for example. So on that note, on its own, Mary has combined two aspects that are very interesting. Oh my God, would you believe it? B, you get rain-making sites on top of all of this combination, right? So what the hell is going on here, right? I'm sure a lot of people in the audience, they are familiar with rain partitioning. I have switched the term to rain partitioning because it's not really correct. People did not make rain, they partition for it because it's a spiritual process that has a lot of medium. But with B, what we have is a rain partitioning site, right? Previous research by Schoeman 2006 in her PhD, she finds that in B, there were a lot of stone tools, which we get at Little Mark. They are hunter-gatherer tools. But this is a farmer space, and in what appears to be a farmer activity of partitioning rain, then what are hunter-gatherers doing there, right? These are some of the questions that I hope to unpack, and I will not dare provide answers now. This is another view of the shelter, simply just depicting the areas highlighted in the previous map of A, B, and C, so that you can have a better view. I know the A is a little bit skewed, but I think Tim was making this map, so so A on the previous map depicts Mbera complex. This map was formulated with the data that we acquired from this year's field trip. Yeah. Yes, when we did mapping. So this is just to show you some of the features that are present there inside the shelter space. A lot of the people here, they will get a chance to actually see these features. We have a possible grain bin foundation, which we use as storage devices, down flooring, because we do know that farmers, they like to plaster down inside their huts as a form of flooring. It's inside a shelter, a hunter-gatherer space. Go figure. And then we have rock, and then we have a previous trench by the excavators who conducted the research. Unfortunately, their record keeping was not very thorough, so we cannot do much with their data. Hence, I will establish then a new trench, more or less closer to there, so that we can have a better understanding of what's going on in this shelter space. And then interestingly, this is another aspect of Mbera complex that is fascinating. When we were doing the mapping and then also taking drone footage, we noticed that in and around the shelter, well, not in and around it, on the right-hand side of the shelter, we have a pack of boulders that are natural in their organization, but they seemed to have been utilized in one way or another. So it's interesting now because we have another aspect that emerges from Mbera complex, which is people being associated with the landscape, right? And different types of people. So this would be the Eastern Living Area indicated by the surface material there. And then we've just called this area a boundary complex. You will note that the black dots here, they indicate rock cupules, which were used to grind different materials, foods, medicine, muti, and so on. They're located inside this fascinating natural feature we have called the boundary complex. Oh, the midden on top as well is located there. And midden is, for those who are not familiar with it in the audience, is an area where people would dump all their I can say their
Rubbish.
Yeah, they are rubbish, right? I was avoiding the term, but that's where they would dump their rubbish. So a midden is that type of an area. We also have a midden north of the boundary complex. This is just an extension of the boundary complex with terracing along the escarpment at different altitudes of the Mbera complex. So I'll try to race through the next few slides just to detail some of the methods that I will be using to study the aforementioned materials that were recovered, for example, at Little Mark, right? So we will conduct excavations for 2 field seasons. So this next week we begin one of those 2 field seasons to be able to further excavate Mbera complex. So it's going to be July or June, July 2022, and then the second one will be in September. And then when we conduct these excavations, because you know, in a lot of informal talks like this, people become very curious, and instead of leaving with more knowledge, they leave with more questions. So I found it necessary to just briefly explain how we set up our squares and how we actually do the excavations. We simply set up a 1 by 1 meter square, and then we dig that in quadrants. So this is to maintain stratigraphic control, such as provenience and depth, to know where stuff comes from and when that stuff occurs. So it's a bit of geology and archaeology, but it's a very important part of what we do, because if we do not do it, we don't know anything about the stuff that we dig. So I'm gonna skip this slide because I've been pouring a lot of information. So stone tools, right? I will analyze stone tools for this because, as I indicated, they are predominantly hunter-gatherer tools, but now they occur in a site that seems to be a mixture, or rather a homogenization of these different groups. So we also investigate stone tools. There are different methodologies and typologies that we follow with stone tools. And then I'm also going to look at ceramics. As I said, they are predominantly a farmer wear, but we also find them at Mbere, and interestingly, also on the surface, which more or less those we have recovered on the surface, they date to the K2 period. Glass beads, which are trade wealth and trade items. I would also look at the glass beads. I'm simply going to focus on their form, color, and inclusion, because these can also tell us not just what the glass beads represent to the people who had them, or rather in terms of the faces, because with glass beads as well, I'll make a quick example. We have glass beads that are Mapungubwe type series beads. We have K2 type series beads. But by studying further form, color, and inclusion, we can also learn where across the Indian Ocean these glass beads come from, because glass beads are not native to South Africa, except for garden rollers, which were manufactured here, but using implements from across the Indian Ocean. So by studying glass beads now, we can not just only connect the people on this landscape amongst themselves and their relations, but with people across the Indian Ocean as well. And hunter-gatherers would have been, intermediary in that process of bringing the glass beads into the interior. And also ostrich eggshell beads. I've learned that these beads are fascinating more than we have actually realized as archaeology. Of course, there is ethnography around them, but these beads, they can tell us so much. As Kamukelo posed that important question, there are many questions like that amongst common folk about what these beads were used for, but archaeologists, because some of them, their work is devoid of ethnography, they do not integrate that. But OES beads, also known as ostrich eggshell beads, they can tell us a lot about them. I can go on forever about this because I'm currently doing research on them, so I'm quickly going to move on to the next slide. But out of interest, and this is something that we noted at Little Muck, right? This image over here shows a very unique way of manufacturing OES beads. It's called Pathway 2, stages 3 and 4. Also, you get stage 5, which is hard to distinguish. But in particular, these two stages of manufacturing OES beads, because when you manufacture OES beads, I'm sure anyone who's familiar with the process, you first drill a hole through the bead, right? And then you shape it on the external diameter. Pathway 2 follows a very unique way of manufacturing OES beads. You first drill the external diameter and then the hole. At Little Muck, at the moment, I think I have recovered around 6 of these beads, which could be the most in Southern Africa if you exclude the previous study by Inner Plug late when archaeology was not good at all. But what we have found now is that there's actually could be 6 Pathway 2 OES beads at Little Muck, which could be the most in Southern Africa. Of course, the reason why people use this method is still unknown to us, which also will be unpacked as part of the study. I'm going to skip fauna because I'm not a bone person and I saw a lot of bones today, so I don't want to traumatize myself. Okay. So I've talked a lot of things, right? But as I said, in talks like this, it's difficult for people to absorb all of the information. But simply, I'm sure you're wondering what are the aims and the rationales of this project, right? So by excavating and studying Mbere, there are 2 things that I wish to establish. One is to determine whether hunter-gatherers residing at Mbere assimilated into farmer society, as we see, for example, at July Shelter, Ufowapop, and so on, Mamangwa, and also Tombo Shelter in Botswana, or whether they abandoned the shelter when farmers arrived. So now we can establish this dynamic of power between the two, and also bring in the rain partitioning space on top. What does it mean if they abandon it? Then why do we see a continuation of their stone tools on the rain partitioning space? and also to analyze the continuities and discontinuities in material culture. By that I mean, what is being made, when is it being manufactured, and why? Very simple questions, hard though to unpack. This broadly is to understand the site's history and occupation sequence over different periods, right? Zizo periods and so on, which we use as chronological markers. So the expected outcomes, pretty much they stem from the research, right? So, but I will emphasize and elaborate on them a bit because I think they are very important. So with the expected outcomes of my study is to have a broader understanding of the contribution of foragers to the larger sequence of the MOV. And mind you, I showed you all those A and B and C, which I'm sure a lot of people have forgotten about now. But those spatial layouts can give us such a broader understanding of foragers in the MOV, and also most importantly a different understanding which you don't get in shelters like Little Mark, Baleno, Chisiku, and all of the other normative hunter-gatherer shelters, and also to understand how identities change over time, because identities do not just change for historic, or rather I'd say archaeological communities that we study, but they change for us as well to this day, right? Every day each of us are changing our identities. So if we can investigate that in the past, then it becomes really interesting. But Mera Complex will be a one step further to understanding identity manifestation in the second millennium. Of course, building on from Little Mark, and also, as I said, the co-occupation of space during a time which we have termed a time of social upheaval, when interaction was at its highest, trade also was booming, and also exchange between different groups was at its end. So it also is to understand how foragers contributed to the emergence of Mapungubwe. This is something was highlighted earlier by Tim. That is still an ongoing process, because the understanding of how foragers contributed to Mapungubwe is minimal, to be honest. So also is to reconstruct the inclusive history and investigate changes in settlement patterns. Oh, this is repetition. How bad of me. I'm gonna end now. But this, for me, is the most exciting slide in this. Tim spoke a lot about what we can do going forward with this group and with the research that we have, right? Interestingly enough, I have began investigating what I call hunter-gatherer variability. As it has been shown that hunter-gatherers have not been acknowledged in the archaeological record, right? But what about the differences amongst themselves, right? Not all black people are the same, not all white people are the same, right? So hunter-gatherer variability is very difficult to investigate, but in a previous publication from last year, I tried to unpack this informally so, but this is also an idea that can be explored. What are the differences between this group that we are all of a sudden interested in? But it's a difficult thing to unpack, but something that can be done in the future. And then this leads me to this point, especially when you bring in Mapungubwe, which we do know that is the site in Southern Africa that reached state level society, right? Everywhere in the world, there is a concept of complex hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers who are able to survive on the landscape, who are able to adapt, participate in change, and also make an impact, right? Vaguely, those have been termed complex hunter-gatherers. That idea, I believe, can still be explored in the Middle Limpopo Valley, especially since we have so many sites of hunter-gatherers, and leading on from the argument of variability, different types of hunter-gatherer groups. So we can still explore complex hunter-gatherers, right? Because if farmers can be complex one way or another, hunter-gatherers can also be complex if they're involved, especially in farmer relations. Rock art, I'll be honest, I was bored of rock art at first. I just saw the images and I wanted to sleep on the spot. But rock art can also rock art can also tell us a lot, right? I'll return to the example that Kamuhelo made. We cannot also be able to understand some of the significance of the material culture we have, because a lot of it is reflected in rock art, and we can analyze that using ethnography. The rock art in this region has not really been studied. It has been documented by people like Ed Eastwood, but it has not been really studied. And there are unique features in this region that you don't find anywhere else. Like there's these images called the Y shapes, which could represent aprons. those images are still not understood, even though we know now that there are aprons linked with shamans in the transcendence, but there are a lot of images in this region that are not yet understood. The kudu, for example, is very significant in this region. Whereas in areas like the Drakensberg, it's the eland, but the kudu here has not also been extensively studied. So in terms of rock art, and I'm sure HARP in the next few years will unpack this, there's a lot that we can learn with rock art. And this is the last point, which links to a member of HARP, Justine van Heerden. So this is living heritage and community participation, right? So it's not just only about studying the landscape and studying these cool sites that we go to and get blasted by the sun all day long, but also it is to bring in communities around the area to be interested in the archaeology, to participate in the archaeology. And then that will lead us to decolonizing that archaeology, which has been a very Eurocentric discipline. We need it to be community-based, engage with the communities and get them involved. And I'm sure that is one of the agendas that HARP has, right? I'm going to skip the point on different strands of evidence, but also by looking at these different, I think I've made it very clear in my talk that different types of material culture, if we link them together, they can paint a very broader picture. So also is to look at different strands of evidence, not just one thing, but different things like GIS, agent-based modeling, spatial analysis, floral analysis, which has not been done, subsistent patterns in the MOV in terms of what people eat when they eat it, has not been thoroughly conducted except for one master's research. There's still ground there that we can explore to further understand these communities and also herder residues, right? There are herders in this landscape, but we do not know much about them. That is still a research avenue for the future. Yes, thank you everyone for listening to my talk. And I'd like to thank our panelists.
Okay, I'm Courtney Knell. I'm currently doing my honors degree in archaeology at the University of Pretoria, and my project is covering a very interesting class of artifacts that we've recently discovered at Little Muck Shelter, and also a single specimen that was actually recovered from Bellona Main Shelter, which is quite close to Little Muck. So, alright, so a quick anatomy lesson for some of the terminology I might use. So this is an arrowhead, very classically easy to understand arrowhead. So the tip is the convergent point, i.e. the sharpie sword point, and then the tang is the elongated work point on the bottom, which in like hunting implements would often be hafted and used obviously as a hunting implement like spears and that kind of thing. The barb is actually an extension on the side. It could be on both or just one side, or it couldn't be there at all. And this is often used for especially hunting implements because it is more so related to like effective lodging in an animal. So it's more likely to be effective in hunting. Right, so not all arrowheads look like this. It would be great if they were easy, but no. So even you can look here at like different kinds of arrowheads from Southern African contexts. They vary. This one doesn't have a tang or arguably a barb. So they vary a lot, and these aren't even all the categories you can find. So arrowhead morphology, especially in Southern African context, is a big issue to take into account when doing the study. So what have we found to break the suspense? Well, we've potentially found arrowheads. Right. You can see where I was going there. There you go. All right. So at Little Muck Shelter, which is one of the main shelters, obviously, that we started with HARP, which is Hunter Gatherer Archaeological Research Project. We have actually found 8. These two bottom drawings are actually from the first season. Those were recovered in season, and then the others were recovered in like sequential analysis. Actually, while we've been here last week, we recovered actually 2 more specimens for the study, which is quite exciting. And everybody keeps coming to show me like ones that could be, and then Tim's like, no, not enough retouch, and then you can't say it. So we have found 2 more, which is quite exciting. But all these specimens were located in seal deposits, which is great because we have controlled locational data, which is rare across these kinds of artifacts. And they're also in 2 of these lowest layers. So we have controlled provenience and a very clear idea of where they came from in the site. And they don't appear in any upper layers. So they're pretty clustered there. All right. And yeah, as you can see, this is a map of Little Muck, the grids. As you can see, looking at the entire site, they're also all located very close to each other in the same squares. One of the specimens we actually recovered is from H42, so that is over here. So it's literally in this like clustered area. Obviously it is along the line, but because they're close to each other, it kind of corroborates their association with each other. All right, that's just to give you a kind of idea of the scale. They are small. They are very small. Everybody keeps like trying to show me these big rocks that look like arrowheads. No, they're actually quite small. But yeah, it's just kind of gives some scale. And then we have Ballina Main Shelter. So Ballina Main Shelter is actually located just 6 kilometers from Little Muck. And a specimen was actually recovered there in the early 2000s by Van Doorne. Now that's actually the little sketch of the arrowhead that was found there. Only one, and there were quite a few seasons of explorations going on, so it's obviously a very rare one. It is also from a seal deposit, so we also have controlled locational data for it. And because there's only one at that site, but they're very close together to Little Muck, obviously, we're going to obviously analyze them together. All right, so what the frick does this mean? So looking at this map, something should already stand out, i.e. the cluster and what is not falling in the cluster or where the cluster is located. So a lot of early specimens, especially of arrowheads, and the documentation wasn't done, as people have mentioned, archaeology back then wasn't great. So a lot of that early locational data has been lost over time. And as anyone could know, if you don't have context for an artifact, you can't really say much about it in that it exists. So we have actually, obviously, this map is from Smiatsky 2017, and all these interior sites, this cluster is all the stone-tanged arrowheads that have been documented, and this is corroborated by extensive research across Southern Africa. So a few outlier sites have been identified. So the bottom one is Nelson Bay Cave, where 3 specimens have been recovered, and that top little triangle, because again, Ballina Main and Little Muck is quite close together, that little triangle shows there. Now, something should already stand out. 2 things. Outliers exist, yes, but there are very few. So that's also something that's leaning into why these specimens are so important and why we want to look at them. So as you can see, they are clustered generally in the interior of the country. And the only outlier sites so far is 2 documented, and obviously Little Muck's ones have not been published yet. That's kind of my job at this point. So what are they doing here? Again, great question. So my project is basically going to look at identifying these arrowheads. As I mentioned, their morphology is quite variable. They look different. Even the material looks different. And in the end, when you look at it and you actually get tested by a geologist, they're all just quartz, but they all look different, even in the photos I showed you. So they're quite variable. So my job is basically to look at, can I prove X amount are actually arrowheads based on their attributes? Because they are uncharacteristic for the region, we need to first prove that they are arrowheads. It's very important. And then after that, we can look at how they actually fit into the later Stone Age in the Limpopo Valley. So yeah, my project's basically going to look at identifying them and getting their chronology, which, as I mentioned with the earlier contextual issues, we don't have a lot of contextual data for a lot of those surface finds. So confirming their identity and getting precise chronological dates is quite important for this project, and like a big plus. And then also kind of understanding how they fit into Little Muck, because they're not being found in the other sites. They haven't popped up anywhere. And also compared to Ballina Main, where there's 1 specimen, we found quite a few probable ones at Little Muck. So the large proportion of them also make them quite unique. So I'm basically going to figure out what that means. And yeah.
Good afternoon. Still afternoon. I'm Sylvia Ubisse. I'm currently in my honors year. My project title is Little Muck Social Landscaping, Peopling and Change in the Late Holocene. My research focused on the Greater Mapungubwe landscape. This is the nicer map that Tim showed you. This is nicer than that. There's all the names. I will focus in particular around the circle, looking at Little Muck Shelter as my anchor site, as my main site, Leokwe Hill, and Mbere Complex. I chose these 3 sites because Little Muck is a later Stone Age site, Leokwe is an age site, Mbere is mixed, not because SK says it's a cool site, but it is a cool site. A brief introduction to my research. The Mapungubwe landscape, the one that I showed you earlier with names, from the mid-Holocene onwards, is characterized by shifts and change in late Stone Age material. From at least 12,000 BC, accelerating into the first millennium AD up until Mapungubwe was abandoned. That is around AD 1300. During this period, dynamic changes occurred on the landscape. This includes social complexity and tool specialization. There is a clear evidence of contact and interaction between foragers and farmers on the landscape. Over time, farmers dominated the landscape. Hence, we see the appearance of Leokwe Hill during the contact phase. However, at Little Muck Shelter, the area was continuously occupied during the pre-contact phase up until Mapungubwe was abandoned. So my project will examine possible reason why this small area, the area around the red area around Mapungubwe landscape, hosted such key technological and socio-political changes. My research will try to answer this question. How did the Little Muck landscape change between 12,000 BC and AD 1300, and how we can compare it to other sites outside the buffered area? I will use already collected data, some from Dr. Forssman team's master's degree. I will compile it into phases from pre-contact phase, contact phase, disease period, and the Mapungubwe phase. After that, I'll transfer my data into a GIS program, QGIS, and provide maps into those 4 phases. I will also calculate the vicinity, the distance between those sites. These are some of the examples of materials that has already been analyzed that I will be using to trace the changes between those 3 sites. The expected outcomes. Studying and closely analyzing Little Muck Shelter, Little Muck landscape will enhance our understanding on the most fundamental and complex changes that occur from mid-Holocene onwards up until the landscape was abandoned. This project will help in understanding why this limited area was favored. Additionally, enhancing our understanding on the technical complexity of the landscape during the most socially dynamic period. Thank you.
Hello.
Okay,
That's the title of my PhD. Simply put, it's just saying that how are people living and moving around spaces. Unlike everyone else here who has done a lot of field work and some part of the field work, my research is still in the proposal area, like proposal phases, and we're still like trying to figure out what we're trying to find, what we're looking at, and all of that. So that is a map of the area showing. I'll be focused like in the areas right here. So what is our current, like what do we want to know? We want to know what gave rise to the landscape shifts in the area, in the landscape, and what role did forager landscape mobilities play in the processes of placemaking, and what were the effects of being in contact with other communities, that being communities such as farmers and herder communities. So the focus, my community of focus here is the LSA, later Stone Age communities, hunter-gatherers. And I'm looking at particularly the mid-Holocene phase, which is subjectively between 7,000 years ago to like 3,000 years ago. Because what has been studied before is foragers on the landscape and what happened once foragers came in contact with other people. And we know, based on the rock art and the literature that exists currently, that there is a presence of foragers on the landscape. There is a presence of herders. We see in the rock art. There is also farmer communities present on the landscape. But the focus is that most of the literature has focused on what happened between foragers and the farmers that were on the landscape. And we need to know what happened before. Like, what were the hunter-gatherers doing before then? How were they living with each other? The social relations that happened among foragers during the time before other communities came by. Because we know, for example, in the Tukela Basin that has been studied by Ariel Mason, we know that foragers have been living together, having social exchanges, having their own economies, using landscapes differently at different sites for like long periods of time before being impacted by other communities. So it would be nice, in my opinion, to know how that is also happening here on the Middle Limpopo Valley. How we aim to investigate this is through excavations. So I'll be looking at sites like Hackthorn, Game Scout Shelter, Boulder Shelter, and Amenia Shelter. All of that data that I'll be getting from these shelters will be compared with other shelters that we've dug before, like Little Muck, and the sites that Van Doornum has dug, like the Siphesihle Shelter and Ballina Main, which are interesting because that's where she highlights the longer presence of hunter-gatherers than other sites. And unfortunately, though, she just states that these people were there. She doesn't really get into how these people were living on the landscapes, how they were using the landscapes, and how, hunter-gatherers were interacting with other hunter-gatherers. So, which is why I picked that focus per se, because... I didn't quite catch that. Do you want me to repeat? Yeah, and then I'll also, theoretical-wise, I'll be using that landscape approach. And then I'll also be using Google Earth and GIS to plot the the archaeological sites that were typically foragers, and then we'll also be able to track the landscape patterns and how they are moving around the landscape to understand their movements and their presence on Limpopo Valley landscape. Thank you.
My name is Justine. Eske also mentioned me, so hi. So there's a very good reason that there is nothing on that screen, and that it is just because I want to turn your attention to this very strategically placed tablecloth, because my master's project is underneath. So this is a traveling museum that we have designed. It is for our community outreach projects, and we will be taking this to people and show this to them. Let me just grab my notes because I've got some words to say. Okay. So the whole point of this project is to make heritage more accessible to people. We are bringing the heritage to people if they are unable to access museums or other heritage institutions. So this is basically an extension of a museum that can be taken to people, thus mobile and traveling. And also what is very nice is that these different drawers, you can place anything that you want in them. These topics can be changed, it can be updated as you wish. This is also creating a museum experience for people that allows them to interact with the artifacts. So this means that people are allowed to touch the things that are in these drawers, which is also very helpful for people with visual disabilities. Also, this specific drawer focuses on hunter-gatherers across the landscape because they are underrepresented. And this is also the focus point of HARP as well. And this also creates the opportunity for us to teach people about archaeological theories and methods and how we excavate. So we will be taking this to a few groups. We are doing one this Saturday where we are taking the museum to the Children of the Wilderness. It's an organization which teaches children about the wilderness.
We will also organize some at the University of Pretoria as well as the University of Mpumalanga, but we will also organize public viewings where people, we are taking it to the public, they can come and look. So it's not just academics, it's for everybody. So I would like you to look at this side. It is not very easily seen, but now you will see. We are trying to explain the concept of stratigraphy on this side. There are different colors on this side. This shows how the different layers of the soil have been deposited and how each one is different. And this is also the units that we excavate in. Another concept that this also shows is the law of superposition. Now this is the law that the layers that are deposited lower down in the earth are older than the ones on the top. So each one of these drawers have a specific topic, and the ones at the very bottom are in an older period than the ones on the top. So it's all the youngest. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the entire speech. I'm not just going to talk about the project. Okay. Oh, wait, no.
Remember the law of superposition?
So the original aim of this project was to place the drawers on top of the museum and then have people joining around so they can easily access and touch the artifacts. But we are a very big group. So I'm going to come and place it on the tables here. And much like the cookies, you can just send it around. So there
Just don't eat these though.
Please don't lick. Okay, so there is a specific way that you need to view this. It is from this way around. So let's start here. And please feel free to pass this along. Feel free to have a feel, have a touch. That is the whole point of this.
They are stuck down, so don't pull them out. It's just to touch them and and see them close up and so on.
There are a few that aren't stuck down that we can pick up and look at because they're so cool. But I will tell you which ones those are. It's none of them. Yeah. So this box has been separated into two time periods. We have the early Stone Age. We have the middle Stone Age. That is what we have in this box. Okay, so basically the early and middle Stone Age falls between 1.75 million years ago until after 250,000 years ago. So hunter-gatherers were present on the Mapungubwe landscape during this time and produced a variety of stone tools, and this is what we see here. So these are three different examples of hand axes. They fall within the Acheulean period, and they were basically used as an axe. We have a chopper core over here that falls into the older one period. So basically they were taking another rock and taking flakes off of the chopper core to create that little ridge. Okay. Then moving on to the middle Stone Age, we have a very big blade in here that was mainly used for cutting and so forth. Then we also have a few convergent flakes. So that's more also just stabbing. I checked this with Tim, he said stabbing, not people.
It was actually just a threat.
Then we here have a scraper that was usually used when they processed hides. They were taking the fat off of the hides with the scraper that we have. And this is a flake. So basically an example of what they were taking off of there, but just very big and on another stone. So not all stone tools are actually the final product. We have little stages in between. But remember the size of these things. Okay. Now we move to the next one. That's where you say, There you go. Okay. This is our latest Stone Age wall. It's so cool. Basically, this is Tim's favorite because that's what he does for a living. Okay, so just in terms of what is stuck down and what is not, all of these three and these three, they're stuck down. Okay, those you can take out. That one is stuck down, and all those in the little glass jars are open. So you can pick them up. You can have a feel. You put them down in that little area right there. So yeah. So this is our latest Stone Age. So mainly colloquial traders and hunter-gatherers were producing later Stone Age artifacts. So please also, we now have the early Stone Age and the middle Stone Age. Please look at the difference in size. It basically is big, smaller, smaller. So basically, like the evolution of the cell phone. That's big, big thing, smaller, 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 thin. Okay, so a very big, not a very big thing about the latest Stone Age is that they're smaller. They are less than 30 millimeters. And also they are highly standardized. So we are finding a lot of tools that are the same. So a lot of scrapers made the same. A lot of blades made the same. Yeah, so that's what we have. This was also mentioned, I believe, by Courtney, is that we also find tools that are being hafted. So that's onto wood or bones and so forth. So what we have here, those are cores. So what happens are people took rocks, they were taking off pieces off the rock, and what we had left was the core. So that's what we have in that one right there. These are examples of the flakes that then came off of these pieces. The flakes were then worked further, they were modified, and we find our formal tools. Those down there, those are little scrapers. They scraped. Okay. This is an adze. I believe that was used with woodworking. Then we also have the long one over there. That is a blade. So that means it's more than 2.5 centimeters in length. We have the little guys over here. Those are bladelets. They're smaller than 2.5. Okay. And then here we also have a backed tool. So it's basically a segment is an example of a backed tool. So it really looks like an orange slice. And then this little edge right here was worked down so that they could be hafted onto wood or bone. Okay. Now also during the later Stone Age we find lots of beads, as Chante also said, and SK. These are ostrich eggshell beads. So you can pick them up, you can look at them, but also just let's be careful. And we also find beads that are made from land snail shell, but I don't have any of those, so I just placed the shell there for you to see. It becomes smaller. So yeah, these are actually animal teeth that we found. So this is also a lot of what we find in later Stone Age sites, and wherever people are eating animals. These are pieces of burnt bone, so dry. That's okay, did everybody have a look yet? Are we still going?
I think we just.
Yeah, let's just keep going. Okay, this is a very good one.
I'd like to just add that this Justine made herself.
What?
She recreated this on an actual rock art panel on this farm on Edmundsburg. She painted it herself, and I think it's absolutely amazing. It's great.
Yeah. So also what we find during the LSA is a whole lot of rock art. The oldest rock art in Southern Africa is from the Apollo 11 cave in Namibia, but most of the rock art in South Africa was painted in the last 1,000 years. So there are two main types of rock art in South Africa. The first is a fine line rock art, which was painted by Forssman. And then we have finger painted rock art, which was generally painted by farmers and Leokwe. So I first want to draw your attention to the artifacts that we have here. Those were made by experimental archaeologist Dr. Nicole Sherwood. So those aren't actually the things that were used to paint rock art, but maybe just approximations of what they would look like. So this is maybe what they would have painted with as a paintbrush. So all she did was she took a little feather, she put some red mud on the end to make it easier to hold, and then she just baked that clay down. Okay. And then these are possible ways that you could have, or what they could have used to hold ochre in. So ochre is one of the materials that they use to gain red pigment for rock art. Now these little tips up there that would now represent the ochre going in. So that would be holders or storers for them. This is a possible way for them to have been holding paint or mixing paint. Obviously, we don't know because some of these things aren't going to be preserved. But this is just, again, an approximation. So, are we ready? Okay. Okay, so you can see there are animals. They are very prominent in rock art. In this area, it's mainly giraffes, hippopotami, impala, and the eland. We also have some depictions of locusts at Muck Shelter, which is very interesting because they are not as commonly found. So the rock art in this drawer, if you noticed, was an SK's presentation as well. It is from Venetia, from Edmundsburg, and we have a depiction of a herdsman over there and a few fat-tailed sheep. Now there are a few interpretations of this. So the one is that this is a bushman herder herding rock art for somebody else. So not for themselves, as Tim mentioned, they were providing a service. The other one is that it is merely a bushman painting of a Leokwe herder herding fat-tailed sheep for themselves. Thirdly, it might be said that bushmen were transitioning and they were starting to herd fat-tailed sheep for themselves again. But the last interpretation is a bit more wordy, and I really like this one. So it is argued that fat-tailed sheep became important for bushmen, their spiritual world. And thus was included in rock art, because most of San rock art is about their spiritual world and what the shamans see when they have do their trance dances and they enter into the spiritual world. So what is important to mention also here that you need to understand is that the eland was a very holy animal to them, and that is why eland is so prominent in rock art. And the reason this is because of the fatty dewlap that they have here in the front. They digested, not inhaled. They digested this fatty dewlap in order to, what's the word? The potency, thank you. To ingest the potency of the animal. Thank you, XK. So, it has been argued that the fat-tailed sheep played the same role because they have fat tails. So, the fat tail, exactly the same as the eland. So, it's sort of argued that is why the fat-tailed sheep might have been playing the same role as the eland. Now, another thing that is also very interesting about this interpretation is that if you look very closely, the herdsman is depicted with the tail much like the ones of the sheep. Now, this is interesting because in other Bushman paintings, while the shaman were entering the spiritual world, they reported their bodies feeling elongated. And in these rock art depictions, they are drawn with eland hooves and eland heads. So, that might be what is happening here. That is what we think. And what is also important is this connects very, very nicely to Chante's project and to SK's project, because this shows how when different people meet, the lines start to blur. Now, I know that we have literally placed these different time periods into boxes, but that does not mean that the lines did not blur. We do find ostrich eggshells in Iron Age sites. We know because we've been digging one and we've been finding them. So we know this is happening. So I don't want anybody to go away from this thinking boxes, because that's not what happened. This box is exactly the opposite of that. Okay. Speaking of the Iron Age. Here we go. Okay, so in the Iron Age, we see the arrival of farming communities into the area, and I think we are all familiar with the differences between farming communities and hunter-gatherers. Obviously, hunter-gatherers hunted and gathered their food, while farming communities planted their food. So farmers were also more sedentary because they needed to stay with their crops, with their harvest, while hunter-gatherers could move around with food everywhere. historically, so we don't really know exactly when farming communities came into the area. It might have been possible that the first few were just transitory groups. They were just moving through, they weren't settling down immediately. But we do have larger farming communities settling into the area around AD 900, like the Zizo community, which has already been mentioned a few times. So they did a lot of stuff, and they left a lot of stuff behind to us. It is so much fun. So on this side of our drawer, we have a few examples of pottery. So obviously this is where they stored their food, prepared their food, used for cooking, and also they have very nice decorations. That's also really cool. And then we have upper grind. Oh no, that's a nutting stone, which is possibly used to nut, to open nuts. This is a little stone that was actually used with the pottery. It was used to smooth out, especially if you look at this one. You can even have a touch on that because it's really, really smooth. That was used to smooth out the pottery on that side. And also, now let's move to the beads. They were creating glass beads, they were creating metal beads, and they were a part of a very large trading network, as Chante told us previously. So we have a nice glass bead over there, a few metal ones around, and then these three are helixes, which are metal beads that they're basically wound up like this. A lot of work. So yeah. Then we also find some smelting activities, which meant that they were making metal objects. This one in the middle is actually an arrowhead, but it wasn't actually for throwing to the animal, it was more maybe ceremonial for guards standing and well guarding. This one is actually a bit more modern, but I also just wanted to show you what that would also look like. This is iron slag, so it's a byproduct that that is produced when they are smelting these metals. So whenever we find that like something had to be happening there, which involved metal. This is a broken piece of the spindle whorl. They were used to weave fabric, so this would actually be entirely circular that way. I actually had no idea how they used this, but then I googled it very quickly. So they had a stick and the spindle whorl went over, and that helped to control the speed at which the fabric was being spun. Okay, these three pieces basically go together. As I said, farming communities, they had crops, they had harvest, and they had to put this somewhere. So they made grain bins, and this was made with clay that we have here, and with dagga, and with a wooden frame to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. So these are actually broken pieces of a grain bin. With this very big one, you can see the indentations of the wooden frame. And this one down here as well, maybe more of a decoration. This is actually dagga that was burned so much that it turned into glass. Dung, sorry. It was dung. Yeah. So possibly the grain bin was burned for an area around it.
Literally shit glass.
I'm not going to read that, but that is basically what it is. I know, but it's your language now. Okay, then we move on to our last draw. Yeah, I know. Anywhere we want really. So this draw isn't actually a period, it's more it's experimental archaeology. So experimental archaeology aims to undertake controlled experiments to provide information and insight into the interpretation of the archaeological record. So what they would do, for example, is they would go and try to recreate the methods that were used to, for example, make stone tools. So they were basically seeing how were the people making the artifacts, the building materials that they were building. Now again, all of these were made by Dr. Nicole Sherwood. She is awesome. I'm very thankful for her contribution to the project. And although this is not a period, it fits very nicely with our law of superposition thing going on, because they are replicas, they're not actually archaeological objects, but they're the most recent that we have, so they're the youngest. Okay, so we have, again, two different sides to this draw. On this side, we have the theme where it shows you the different stages of production of some artifacts, like bone points, like ostrich eggshell, and like stone tools. So bone points, it goes like that. So this was basically made by just scraping the bone on rocks the entire time, although that takes very long. So Dr. Sherwood used a sander. But just she created the points with the actual rocks. Next we have the ostrich eggshell that SK also mentioned earlier. She used, I believe it was the first method. She first took pieces of ostrich eggshell, broke them down with rocks into smaller, more controllable pieces, like the one over there. And then she took stones and started drilling the holes. So first from the top, then from the bottom, and then they met inside, on the inside. Now what she also did is that she took a bone point and placed it inside and just twisted it, just to clean up that hole. So that was also very interesting because she's also finding new use-wear patterns that people have been attributing to something else on bone points, but actually it might be this. So from there on, they then start to work the ostrich eggshell bead down so that it forms a nice little circle. So yeah. Then we have stone tools, like I explained earlier with the LSA box. We first have our core, pieces are taken off. We have our flakes, they're in the middle. They are worked down even more, retouched, and we have the smaller pieces that come off of that. Okay. Now we move to this side. This basically shows how some of these tools might have been used. Okay, so this one over here, that is a bone point. And that was used in a process called a bone pressure flaking. So what happened, they took the hide, placed it in their hand. They would take a piece of stone that they would like to flake off the edges. And they would place the stone on the hide in the hand and start bone pressuring the parts of the bone. The stone with the bone. So, and then what these stones were then used for, they were hafted and then used for various activities. So all of that one you can take off, that one, and this one is not stuck on, so you can all have a nice look at it. So what they did with the handles, they did not have sanders, so they did not look like that. So we just had a wooden handle. They created a slit and they hafted the artifact onto it. And they might have even, in the case of the arrowheads, where I'm going to now, is wrapped around some leather or sinew just to tighten that up. Now those I just added because they were seriously cool. That's tile. Nikki created arrowheads with tile. She was actually just looking at the effectiveness of soft hammer percussion, so with a wooden hammer, and this is what came from that. So basically also a big part of experimental archaeology is using what is around your area. And that brings me to the glass pieces that they have down there. So all of these are glass. This one over here is obsidian. So that is what Courtney's arrowheads would look like if they were hafted. Now that Nikki actually just made because she needed a keychain for her keys. True story, I'm not kidding. And she used this edge of the arrowhead to cut stuff off, like from the tags on clothes. That's why if you look at it, there's some use wear on the side. Seriously cool. So yeah, that is everything. I hope you enjoyed it.